Locals later said the fog that morning felt tired, the kind that settles instead of lifting. He eased his red kayak off the quiet launch before first real color reached the channel. A low radio check answered by soft static and gull yawns farther out. 10 paddle strokes and the hull was a faint pulse. 20 and only the rhythm of drip and draw marked his place inside the pale gray. The estuary around him held its breath. No wind riffle, just the slow inward and outward tug beneath a skin of pewter. Shore grass beaded and leaned, keeping a blurred outline. Behind, the narrow pier returned to stillness almost too easily, as if unburdened. A cormorant surfaced once, shook mist from its head, then folded back under. Past a barely audible bell buoy, the fog thickened again, and whatever slim wake he made softened, thinned, and disappeared. After that point, the morning offers no more certain frame, only quiet water, a widening guess. He kept small habits people later listed because they suddenly mattered. A thermos half-filled so it would cool to a sip temperature by the first channel turn. A single strip of reflective tape on the paddle shaft where his lower hand naturally settled. A habit of touching the dock post twice, a quiet count, before pushing on. On ordinary mornings, he would message a brief off note once clear of the slip. That day, no follow-up arrived, yet early hours offered plenty of innocent reasons. Patchy reception in dense fog, fingers chilled, routine so ingrained he simply forgot. Shore sound thinned quickly inside the gray. The pier, after its brief clatter of prep noises, returned to an almost relieved stillness. His voicemail later held mundane fragments, missed logistics, a friend's gentle joke, already feeling older by the afternoon. These small, unremarkable anchors became, in absence of later ones, a shallow last shelf of normal time people kept touching in their minds. Real concern did not bloom at the first missed check. Fog mornings sometimes meant drift delays or a deliberate pause to wait for clearer sightlines at the channel's mouth. A midday tide report came and went, messages stacked, each slightly more pointed but still mild. By late light, the absence acquired a colder edge. Family retraced the path to the launch. Damp indentations on the timber still dark but indistinct. No paddle scuff fresh enough to claim. The logbook line, time of departure, initials, sat bare, almost too neat. A phone call chain began, moving from casual, "Seen him?" to a flatter, "He hasn't come back," cadence. Evening marine haze thickened again, softening horizon cues for anyone scanning with binoculars from shore. Night's first gull cries winged low, their routine pattern a faint contrast to the growing irregularity of silence where an ordinary return chatter should have folded back into place. At first light of the second day, volunteers met near the slip with thermoses and borrowed radios, dividing shoreline into overlapping arcs. Early assumptions stretched search grids broadly seaward, projecting a gradual drift or slow capsizing, rather than considering how a quiet object could settle inland within labyrinth marsh fingers. Fog behavior complicated sightlines. It pooled in windless pockets and thinned along higher reed spines, creating deceptive corridors where observers believed they saw farther than they did. Paddle fragments photographed and shared were each dismissed, different paint, wrong wear pattern, but the act of collecting them widened the apparent map, pulling energy away from tighter inlets. Offshore boats swept slow zigzags past the bell buoy, engines low to parse any unusual float. Hours spent expanding radius left inner tidal creeks undertouched, a classic early expansion error, the geometry of absence inflating outward while the most delicate retention zones remained quiet behind screens of grass. The marsh and heavy fog became a layered stage of muffled thresholds. Sound fell short, curling back in on itself. An engine 2 bends away could mimic 1 mile out. Volunteers learned how easily a paddle slip, a cough, or a hull knock could be devoured within damp air before crossing even a modest channel. Visual range contracted into pale gradients, reed silhouettes flattening so distance estimates skewed shallow. A bright object could still disappear beneath a thin sill of reflecting surface bloom. These sensory limits fed benign theories. He must be riding out disorientation until lit. Each hour the fog held. Ordinary delay narratives retained life. That endurance postponed emotional pivot to true alarm. Only toward late afternoon, when a brief tear in the ceiling revealed nothing moving where a patient drifter should have been, did the group mood shift from conditional patience to unsettled quiet. Even then, inward marsh pockets remained largely unwalked. Tide cycles imposed their own masking rhythm. The morning flood lifted light debris, teasing movement. Then the ebb laid silt like a soft sheet over any transient impressions a hull edge might have pressed against submerged grass crowns. Narrow windows existed when a submerged object could mark, shift slightly, and resettle before being veiled. Volunteers unfamiliar with these micro-phases leaned on broad published tables, not the finer local cadence experienced harvesters once read by smell and faint current temperature changes. Miss a slack, plus the first pull, and a whole pattern of subtle settling traces vanishes under uniform film. The day's coordinated sweeps, misaligned with those finer pulses, produced clean reports that falsely suggested nothing disturbed. Absence of sign became thin confirmation loop feeding the initial offshore focus. Inside the unvisited loops, slow water exchanged with just enough delay to retain denser items where reeds broke flow, a quiet holding lattice patiently unexamined. During the first full night, the family's sense of time stretched. Clocks advanced, but meaning sat still. They replayed earlier weeks searching for any hint of risk. A new route, a stray comment about pushing farther, none emerged. He had not been in a restless mood, had made no equipment changes beyond retying a frayed deck cord. Normalcy itself became unsettling. Without a lead-in irregularity, the absence felt like a curtain dropped mid-line. People phoned through circles of acquaintances until overlap produced the same bland assurance. No conflict, no debt, no fatigue complaint. They tried to sleep in segments. One person lightly dozing near a charged phone. Each ring expectation carried a small hope that an embarrassed apology would end the script. The sound never came. Dawn returned with a drained flavor, casting the launch in colorless wash, as though the place had been lightly erased rather than simply paused. As days stacked, search lines ballooned. New volunteers naturally extended margins outward. Kayaks fanning seaward in petal shapes charted by GPS traces, later admired more for symmetry than yield. The elegant outward geometry created an illusion of thoroughness, while inner marsh pockets still received only cursory passes at high water, when clues stayed veiled. A subtle morale drift began. Expanding radius felt like progress, so energy followed visual theater. An experienced clamor finally pointed at an unentered narrow feed barely wider than an oar, and asked whether anyone had poled it at low water. Silence answered. By then, collective narrative momentum resisted pivot. Adjusting course inward carried the implied admission. Early assumptions cost valuable clarity. Humans prefer additive action to revision, so the map kept flowering. A quietly inefficient bloom overriding the modest core that still held untested quiet. Fog-heavy mornings blurred into a single long, damp corridor in memory. Volunteers later struggled to distinguish which day certain small exchanges occurred. The anecdotal timeline bleaching into generalized early week haze. Memory's edges softened. Which tide had the slight oily sheen? Which sweep produced that hollow metallic float structure? Such details, unanchored, lost forensic texture. The family kept a plain notebook to freeze fragile specifics. Snatches of smell, iodine sharp, then a sweeter rot hint. Notes on wildlife patterns. A heron absent from a usual perch. Any deviation, no matter how mundane. Writing gave shape to time so it did not pulp into undifferentiated waiting. That notebook, more than broadened grids or online speculation, became their stabilizing artifact, an internal counterweight to the outward swelling narrative that risked dissolving early ground truth under layers of approximated retelling. Family strategy settled into quiet filtering. They deliberately ignored dramatic outsider messages pushing elaborate third-party theories absent tangible anchor, focusing instead on mundane consistencies, tide logs, wind shifts, maintenance of gear lists. They rotated short shoreline circuits, not because they expected a belated surface appearance, but to maintain relational presence with a landscape that easily normalizes absence. A simmering tension existed between engaging community help and letting rumor loops seed self-amplifying noise. They erred on the side of scarcity, offering brief factual updates, declining to speculate publicly, keeping the center of the narrative small enough to remain honest. That smallness, while frustrating to some online followers hungry for twists, preserved emotional stamina. In private, they allowed grief spikes. In public, they modeled restraint. Restraint did not mean passivity. It meant active pruning of narratives that could calcify into false anchors. Official attention tapered in measured increments. Press cycles shortened. Articles compressed from full columns to summary paragraphs. Marine Patrol presence shifted toward routine patterns. New tips arriving carried a faint echo of earlier ones. Recycled phrasing hinting at social contamination rather than independent recall. The family learned to read these tonal repetitions, tagging them mentally as noise. This thinning spotlight paradoxically lifted a separate weight. Performance pressure eased, allowing a slower, less reactive internal processing. Yet resource scarcity also meant certain specialized surveys, fine grid side scan passes in shallow interior creeks, never advanced. The case entered that ambiguous plateau common to unsolved maritime disappearances. Not formally closed, not actively escalated, a suspended middle where the unknown neither shrinks nor meaningfully expands, simply coexisting with daily life like a low barometric reading. In that flattening, patience shifted from emergency stance to long, quiet stewardship. Seasonal shifts began smoothing harsh edges. Summer reed vigor dulled, seed heads browned and laid softer screens over narrow entrances. Evaporation left faint salt rime on mudflats each afternoon, a powder that later tide tongues smeared into subtle marbling, obscuring any discrete trace older than a single cycle. The marsh's slow chemistry worked as archivist and eraser, storing denser objects gently under silt while sanding context from surfaces that might have explained orientation or sequence. Air carried a stratified scent, iodine base, sweet rot mid-band, a dry hay whisper above. Such layered sameness is compassionate to wildlife, yet unkind to investigative memory, lulling observers into a perception that nothing changes enough to warrant renewed scrutiny. In truth, micro-variation rotated daily, but without a fixed reference artifact, each shift passed unleveraged. Absence acquired a patina of naturalness that later complicated renewed urgency. 18 months seems both brief and cavernous when mapped onto a single unresolved morning. In the days leading to the storm that would rearrange silt layers, subtle precursors lined up. Barometer fall, a metallic tang in pre-rain humidity, shore grass leaning uniformly inland. Local fishers secured loose gear, muttering modest concern rather than alarm. The family logged those environmental notes out of habit, not foreknowledge. The inner marsh channels tightened their grip on trapped organic matter, primed for scouring once surge water reversed. A rarely monitored feeder creek, shallow and easily overlooked on fair days, aligned to become a future conveyor belt. Hidden beneath its bland surface lay packed fines and discarded seasonal debris forming a thin cap over pockets of slightly denser material. One such pocket soon to be disturbed just enough to free a small hard object without flinging it far. The storm itself arrived without theatrical violence. No dramatic sideways sheets. Just sustained, insistent rain knitting water surfaces together while wind pressed a broad hand over open reaches. Overnight, layered runoff freshened upper inlets, raising a turbid lens that traveled outward on the falling tide, undercutting the settled skin of silt in narrow recesses. Reeds flexed and funneled energy. Small surge pulses acted like gentle pry bars along banks. Debris lifted. Reed sheath curls, a lost glove finger, film scraps of plastic. In the dark, these micro-launches passed uncelebrated. What mattered was cumulative shear along the seldom-visited inner shelf, where the overlooked creek met a slightly deeper pocket. There the cap thinned, puckered, and finally tore a modest window. Density and contour of the tucked object resisted full entrainment. Instead, it rolled, rotated, and staged itself half-revealed for discovery in the calmer slack that followed. Morning recession exposed a changed texture, subtle scallops where smooth panels of mud had rested, isolated gleams where water leaving left wet skins stretched thin. A volunteer working a habitual loop paused at a low glint partly veiled in eelgrass filaments. 2 fingers cleared enough silt to outline a small, scarred rectangle. Not electronics recognition first, just shape, hardness, and unexpected man-made regularity. The casing wore salt bloom freckles and faint impact nicks. A lens window filmed by mineral haze but uncracked. Its position, angled, not fully prone, suggested partial recent liberation, not long surfacing. The volunteer resisted impulsive powering, nesting it in a dry bag instead. A call relayed inward with controlled tone, hope tempered by procedural caution. In that measured handling lay months of learned restraint. Excitement compressed so chain of custody could carry clean intention forward. Physical assessment took place on a plain towel under diffuse light. Not a spotlight scene, just careful hands. The outer shell's abrasion pattern read like a Tide diary, broad, matte, scuffing on one side, preserving a cleaner panel on the face, likely pressed into silt. Salt crystallization bordered screw heads where evaporative cycles had wicked brine, then stalled. A single shallow gouge along a corner ridge hinted at brief contact with a harder angular fragment, perhaps a shell or weathered glass shard, during its short roll free. Micro-barnacle starters appeared aborted, early colonization interrupted, implying the casing spent enough time submerged to invite settlement, but not long enough for mature growth. The card slot seal lip held a thin line of compacted fine mud, acting as a gasket. All small signatures converged on a narrative of sheltered partial burial followed by recent gentle unseating, rather than prolonged open exposure. That it still held a readable card felt less like luck and more like quiet environmental engineering by circumstance. The silt bed's fine grain packing out oxygen movement, moderating corrosion, low turbulence sparing it from repeated abrasive micro-rolls, orientation limiting direct UV when brief low tides bared the surface. A more active storm earlier might have either driven the device far seaward or shattered seals enough to leach files. Instead, the long lull acted as preservation chamber, quelling both chemical aggression and mechanical scour. People spoke of the camera surviving, yet survival here meant inactivity, a suspended pause aligning with the family's own waiting posture, suggesting how stillness, often read as void, can quietly shelter information if not overhandled. Even now, restraint mattered. Powering prematurely while internal temperature still equilibrated could have risked condensation shock. Patience, once more, served both emotion and data integrity. Data extraction staged deliberately, controlled dry environment, desiccant packs set hours prior, battery leads checked for salt bridging. The card released with a faint tack, fine mud ring breaking. Initial directory structure appeared intact, a sequence of date-stamped files aligned with routine habitual paddles leading up to the morning. Early clips played as expected. Smooth strokes, low-angle horizon, occasional paddle flash, muted ambient gull chatter eaten by fog. Nothing cinematic, just the ordinary road noise equivalent for water travel. A quiet dread accompanied that normalcy. Common patterns can narrow interpretive space when a break finally arrives. Each unremarkable minute affirmed baseline conditions. No hull flex squeal, no slapping intrusion, no change in cadence that might foreshadow evasive action. The mundane kept confirming itself, tightening anticipation around the known gap near the end. Second to last file introduced subtle deviation. Condensed droplets smudged the periphery, either lens moisture accumulation or fine aerosol from a gentle shift in air movement. Paddle rhythm slowed half a beat for several cycles, then returned. Could be adjustment for interior fog thickness, repositioning a glove, nothing conclusive. Water surface texture remained glassed, lacking rip or cross-chop that might preface external hull contact. An indistinct low scrape murmur registered, ambiguous, interior deck shift, paddle edge grazing a concealed blade of eelgrass, or distant anthropogenic sound refracted. The camera angle stayed consistent, horizon neither canted nor occluded. These micro-elements, while tempting to inflate, sat within the envelope of benign variation. Their value lay not in dramatic signal, but in narrowing accident profiles. Absence of violent motion, absence of immediate pursuit pattern, absence of mounting vocalization. Final recorded file opened on calm continuity, then carried a small mechanical flutter, likely internal image stabilization element reaching a threshold, followed by a single slight downward tilt as if the bow dipped or the paddler leaned forward to adjust something near the deck. No abrupt rotational spin, no sudden occluding splash cascading across lens. Instead, the frame settles into a nearly static hold on a pale veil of water, faint reversed current threads suggesting proximity to a subtle back eddy near marsh interior. Ambient sound thins further. Even gull calls drop out, replaced by a soft, almost cottony hush. Then the file stops, cleanly. No corrupted trailing artifacts, just orderly termination earlier than pattern would predict. That simplicity deepens intrigue. Catastrophic events often leave digital noise. The calm sever here feels curated by either circumstance aligning perfectly or intervention pressing a stop before removal. Interpretive space opened exactly where pixels ended. The neat cutoff without post-event disturbance argued against an immediate capsize or blunt collision. A sudden health event could produce cessation without upset, yet one might expect paddle drift or later lens angle change if the unit remained affixed while hull wandered. Manual stop leans toward intentional act, but why leave the device to re-enter tide choreography after? Conversely, card write error could mimic intent, but file integrity checks passed. The absence of closing turbulence or muffled contact noise trimmed away certain scenarios while refusing to anoint a single clear successor. Family faced a paradox. They finally possessed something, yet that something drew edges around ignorance rather than filling it. The camera delivered boundary, not answer. A shaped silence now more defined but still resistant to a clean narrative. Quiet accident remained the least dramatic path. A sudden internal failure, faint dizziness, micro blackout, or silent cardiac event while seated upright. In such a scenario, the body's immediate posture might slacken without violent motion. Paddle could slide free, hull drift into slower interior circulation, where reads gradually arrest and submerge evidence. The orderly file stop could reflect a pre-symptom action, adjusting settings, wiping moisture, seconds before collapse outside the frame's narrative reach. Weakness, absence of later drift markers in broadened sweep data, though early search emphasis offshore left some inner lanes underlogged. This explanation asks the fewest extra moving parts and aligns with the camera capturing only calm continuity. It grants no villain, no elaborate misdirection. Its very simplicity makes it emotionally unsatisfying, which can bias collective attention away despite parsimony. Intervention hypothesis carried more narrative gravity. Another presence emerging silently inside fog veil. Another small craft, a wader, shoreline contact, prompting device stop prior to verbal exchange or forced repositioning. For proponents, the clean cutoff feels like a prelude to events the camera does not witness because it was intentionally silenced. Yet evidentiary scaffolding is thin. No secondary audio signatures, no anomalies in recovered peripheral debris, no independent reliable sighting in time window. Fog's acoustic dampening could erase subtle cues, but total absence still strains. Any hostile interaction would need to preserve hull stability enough to avoid lens tilt or impact smear inside the captured tail seconds. Without corroborative trace, this explanation remains a shaped possibility whose appeal partially derives from filling emotional dissatisfaction left by quiet accident narratives. Delayed placement scenario suggests the camera did not rest where found during the disappearance, but was introduced later, either to redirect search energy or to create closure semblance. Its partial burial pattern, however, read as a product of gradual silt settling, not a fresh press. Microcrystallization around screw heads implied multiple wet-dry cycles, complicating a late single-day plant unless convincingly pre-weathered. Motivation also runs thin. Staging yields limited spectacle when file contents show no sensational material. Still, human impulse to author meaning in stagnant cases has precedent. For this path to stand, one must accept a plan prioritizing minimal theatricality, an odd investment for a manipulator. Thus, delayed placement remained a low but non-zero probability placeholder, kept in analytic inventory to avoid premature closure bias. With the camera public, theory bloom risk amplified. The family preempted noise inflation by releasing a structured summary: physical state, file integrity, absence of explicit struggle. They declined to dribble incremental micro-interpretations, reducing reinforcement loops that turn small artifacts into lore. Online, more elaborate speculative trees gained fewer footholds without official ambiguity gaps to colonize. Moderators of a volunteer forum pinned guidelines: differentiate observation from inference, timestamp claims, cite origin or retract. This design limited cumulative myth sediment, stories that in other cases accrete until raw data suffocates. Object scarcity paradoxically helped. One artifact defines discussion boundaries more tightly than cascades of ambiguous microfinds. Discipline preserved analytic breathing room, honoring both uncertainty and the object's quiet voice. A single recovered device altered narrative gravity far beyond its physical volume. Before, absence was amorphous. After, ignorance possessed a crisp edge where the file ends. The camera functioned like a frame trimming fog, making the unknowable smaller yet more concentrated. Listeners adjusted language, less lost somewhere and more unknown between last paddle rhythm and unseen break. That refinement increased emotional focus while avoiding melodrama. It also retuned search modeling. Probability mass redistributed towards subtle medical or low-energy events inside interior retention zones. The artifact's restraint, no dramatic collapse, no shouted plea, became an instructional example. Not all decisive clues produce cinematic narrative. Sometimes they simply subtract improbable branches, leaving a quieter cluster that, though harder to emotionally metabolize, is truer to the texture of available evidence. Remapping began with humility, not a grand new model, just a careful shrinking of the undefined band between last steady strokes and unseen cessation. Volunteers overlaid tide height curves with camera timestamp cadence, marking when interior eddies form faint reverse threads like the ones barely hinted at in the final frame. That pattern nudged focus landward of earlier seaward arcs. Old GPS pedals now looked overextended, decorative rather than diagnostic. A local who reads water by color gradations pointed out a slight tea-stain hue unique to back-eddy nutrient pooling. Archival drone footage from prior seasons confirmed its recurring pocket less than 100 paddle lengths from a neglected narrow feed. This convergence did not solve the space, but it tightened it, trading wide speculative acreage for a small textured interior where gentle failure scenarios retained coherence. Search refinement avoided dramatic sweeps. Instead, it adopted slow pole probing at controlled low water to feel for soft gives beneath silt crust in targeted microbasins. A handful of zones yielded layered resistance: mud, then faintly denser plain, then nothing, suggesting scoured voids now emptied. Logs recorded these negative findings with equal weight to positives. Absence mapped methodically can erode illusion of endless possibility. One volunteer advocated deploying side-scan passes, but draft constraints and read stems created clutter. Results read like abstract stippling. Acceptance of tool limits became part of the ethic. Forcing high-tech where hydrology denies clarity wastes scarce focus. So refinement returned to tactile, patient methods, privileging attention over instrumentation. The narrowed field stood not as promise, but as honest boundary. Here the unknown likely breathed, and outside it, narrative flourish could safely dim. The family's ongoing ritual adjusted slightly in light of the camera. Weekly visits shifted to a quieter cadence of presence within the refined interior arc. Brief, deliberate. No performative sweeping gestures. A small smooth stone still marked each passage of time, but now they placed it at a spot aligned with the recalibrated zone rather than the original launch. An act of symbolic relocation, acknowledging the story's center had moved. They continued writing sensory notes. Muted eelgrass scent after rain, a rarer gull call pitching lower on colder mornings. These fragments, trivial externally, sustained internal relational tethering. They seldom verbalized hope in grand phrases. Instead, they practiced a vocabulary of maintenance: hold, still here, steady, Short, unfussy terms that conserve emotional fuel while honoring the lingering void without theatrics. Lessons crystallizing from the long quiet did not arrive as aphorisms, but as muscle memory. Early radius inflation wastes precision. Restraint protects analytic oxygen. A single object can dignify uncertainty by trimming fantasy, rather than feeding spectacle. Community members reported shifting habits in other unresolved contexts, writing observations before theorizing, flagging when a leap occurred, allowing "I don't know" to stand. The case, instead of delivering a solved arc, yielded a transferable method. Cultivate conditions where modest signals survive undrowned. That ethos also worked inwardly. Grief processed in increments without demanding dramatic catharsis to legitimize itself. The camera's calm final frame, once frustrating, became an emblem of disciplined attention. Evidence can be quietly sufficient to redraw effort without granting narrative appetite a climax. The small core community stabilized into a cadence. Low-noise forum updates, occasional field days, careful onboarding of curious newcomers with a primer on language discipline, separate observation, inference, speculation columns. Drift toward myth remained low. When a speculative flourish surfaced, it was met not with derision, but a gentle request for anchor points, an approach that pruned without scarring trust. This collaborative tone kept the single artifact from being overburdened with symbolic weight. It remained what it was, a bounded slice of time, while collective care filled the surrounding silence with steadiness rather than embellished lore. In that atmosphere, the unresolved did not metastasize into spectacle nor dissolve into indifference. It held a middle temperature sustained by shared, measured witness. Closure remained unavailable, but shape had emerged, a defined interval bounded by routine departure on one side and a calm, prematurely concluded record on the other, bracketed by a landscape whose quiet mechanics plausibly absorbed a low-energy event. That contour, while incomplete, was less injurious than earlier boundlessness. The family accepted that narrative appetite and evidentiary reality rarely synchronize. Acceptance did not mean surrender. It meant reallocating effort from speculative embroidery toward care of the narrowed corridor, keeping it ventilated with periodic honest passes so rumor sediment could not harden over it. What once felt like sprawling vacancy now resembled a contained, tended clearing. In that clearing, absence could be acknowledged without being forced to perform explanation it did not yet possess. If you are listening now, distant from these muted channels, your quiet attention can still matter, not by amplifying unanchored twists, but by modeling how to hold an unanswered span without inflating or abandoning it. Share the disciplined curiosity. Separate what is seen from what is assumed. Allow "we may never know this piece" to stand without rush to patch it. Single artifacts like a calm, early-ending clip can guide practice, even while withholding story. The work here is patient stewardship of a shaped silence. Should another modest object surface, let it arrive into a community already tuned for gentle handling. Until then, witness remains an active verb. Steady, respectful, low noise. Widen, soften, hold, and resist the pull to decorate the gap beyond what the water itself has given. Tide tables print broad strokes, but interior exchange rides on quieter hinges. In narrow feeds, tiny reversal windows open, sometimes only a handful of heartbeats, when opposing threads briefly level, letting suspended fines settle in a faint glitter before the next directional pull resumes. Miss such a micro-slack and the bed record's nothing. Arrive exactly then and a hull edge graze might inscribe a disappearing crescent. Volunteers later overlaid the camera's final timestamp cadence against locally logged salinity dips from a hobbyist sensor, not official data, just a careful residence discipline. A shallow trough in the curve aligned within 2 minutes of the file's clean stop. It proved no scenario. It simply sharpened context. The moment sat inside a hydrologic lull suited to gentle arrest rather than disruptive force. Knowing that kept loud collision imagery from reinflating. It also coached future watchers in other cases to honor small environmental metronomes. Broad hourly charts can hide the precise thin ledges where events slide from visible to absorbed without trace beyond a clipped record. Weeks later, low water exposed the entrance to the feeder creek earlier overlooked. Ankle depth, matte, unremarkable. A patient walkthrough mapped its microtopography. Shallow sill, then a narrow elbow where flow slowed enough for eelgrass to angle inward like soft barbs, followed by a slightly deeper pocket scoured to firmer substrate. A hand probe found layered resistance where fine silt overlay a denser plane that rang faintly under gentle tap, probably compacted organics over a harder lens. If a low-energy medical collapse occurred just upstream, passive drift could shepherd hull and paddle fragments toward that mild arrest zone, settling them below later seasonal deposition before early broad searches even considered stepping inside. The walkthrough produced no recovered object, but it replaced an imagined void with tangible structure, turn angle, sill height, grass rake direction, elements that either support or strain hypotheses. Quiet mapping like this rarely makes summaries. It lacks drama. Yet it corrects the mental scale of "he could be anywhere" to "these few channels function like a selective filter." Precision-traded spectacle for grounded possibility, which is sturdier fuel for sustained attention. The camera did not supply grief with a narrative, so the family reframed its role. Not an answer machine, but a boundary marker that prevented psychic sprawl. They placed a small printed still, just a calm mid-frame water tone, from the penultimate clip inside a plain notebook sleeve. No caption. It sat opposite blank pages where they occasionally logged succinct emotional weather. Drained. Steadier. Hard edge back. Single words curbing pressure to manufacture sweeping reflections. Friends who visited sometimes expected a dramatic playback session. Instead, they were invited to sit a few minutes with the still image and the absence it outlines. This practice discouraged performative retellings that, in other contexts, can calcify into embellished canon. By metabolizing the artifact as a quiet perimeter rather than a dramatized relic, they protected it from narrative inflation while still allowing it to anchor mourning. The calm frame's refusal to sensationalize reminded them that dignity can persist within unresolved space. Over time, relief came less from hope of a late twist and more from confidence they were stewarding the existing fragment responsibly, neither neglecting nor overworking it into distortion. They reviewed anonymized notes from other maritime disappearances where a single delayed object surfaced. A glove cuff dried rigid but contextless, a phone whose last log ended mid-routine, a data logger clipping off before a subtle environmental transition. Patterns emerged. In each, the lone artifact narrowed possibility bands without tipping them decisively. Emotional dissatisfaction often tempted observers to graft speculative agents or dramatic edits onto calm final records. Cases that retained integrity shared certain habits: early containment of language, disciplined separation of observation and inference threads, and refusal to mythologize the object beyond its evidentiary radius. The family drew quiet instruction. A patient audience can be cultivated rather than assumed. You shape it by modeling proportion, treating a clue neither as inert trivia nor as mystical cipher. This case's camera joined that modest lineage of restraint, reinforcing an ethic that evidence may legitimately subtract story beats. Accepting subtraction as progress ran counter to appetites primed by more sensational media arcs. Yet embracing it preserved clarity and conserved emotional resources for any truly additive element future tides might still offer. As seasons tilt again, maintenance replaces urgency as governing verb. Attention becomes periodic tending, brief revisits, notebook updates, gentle calibration of what remains unknown. The shaped silence framed by departure routine, calm early termination, and physical context still holds, but no longer sprawls. If future chance, another storm shear, an erosion pulse, ushers up a second modest item. The groundwork for handling it without distortion already exists. If nothing else emerges, the practice itself is not wasted residue. It is a transferable method listeners can export to other unresolved pockets. Keep scope honest, document before theorizing, let small artifacts set scale, resist drama inflation, allow unanswered spans to coexist with daily life without forcing closure posture. In a culture that often equates volume with care, choosing measured quiet is a deliberate counter-gesture. That choice does not sanctify absence. It simply refuses to coerce it. So the work recurs in low gear. Widen, soften, hold. And for anyone arriving late to this story, participation need not mean generating new angles. Sometimes the most constructive contribution is sustaining the clear air the first artifact asked for by how little spectacle it gave.